Today, we're going to have 4 pieces to our agenda. We're going to start off with letting you know about some key skills that are important for facilitators, then talk through the different steps and components that go into designing a really great facilitation session or meeting. We'll talk about what to do when there's a curveball thrown at you and you're taken off course. And lastly, wrap up with some questions from you all. So let's get started and talk about some key skills. These are 8 key skills that we feel are really important to have. There's many others, but just some really fundamental ones, and things to think about not only as a facilitator, but these are skills that you can practice every day when you're going into meetings, and sharpen those skills and your expertise so that when you're in the seat facilitating, you have done some practice and are able to really think about how to prepare. How you're using an inclusivity lens. Are you being adaptable? Are you being objective? And are you being goal-oriented? So we'll start talking through the different pieces of each one of these skills. So first off, one thing to think about when going into facilitations, even before you get there, prepare. You're going to want to make sure that you're clear on your goals so that your group that's there is also really understanding, coming with a shared understanding. It's really good to also think about the folks you want in the room and be selective on, again, going back to that goal, who's going to help you to, get to the outcome that you want. And also create those conditions for success. So for instance, again, when you're putting together the objectives and the goal, draft an agenda, send that out to the group, let them know how to prepare themselves as they're coming into that space. Next is communication. I mean, this is key. Communication, communication, communication. As a facilitator, you want to make sure that you are actively listening, use your body language, use your nonverbal communication as well, so that folks know that you're engaged, and also provide clarity. It's really helpful. There might be times when people interpret information differently, and so be there to help, paraphrase back the information that you're hearing so everybody's on the same page. Up next, we're going to talk about making sure that you're coming with an inclusivity lens. You want to make sure that you are being empathetic of everyone that's there. Everyone's coming with different backgrounds, different expertise, life experiences. So, having valuing diversity and being inclusive and welcoming is really important to create trust with everyone. So up next too is like being adaptable. We do a lot of preparation when we come to a facilitation session, and sometimes things go as planned, but sometimes different things come up. So we want to make sure that we are being flexible, adjusting to new situations, having an open mind, because being able to do these things creates, the opportunity to have a really good session, even if it's not maybe exactly how you planned. The next 2 skills are, making sure that you are being inquisitive. You want to ask a lot of great questions. You have brought these experts to the table and, help ask questions that are probing, that are going to get them really pushing themselves to think critically and creative and think outside of the box. That's your job, to ask really good questions and also create this really good synergy. I played on sports teams all the way through college, and you just know, like when you're playing with a team, when you're in a room with the team, that you guys are vibing, that everything's going really great. So you want to make sure that you're encouraging sharing so that, everyone is sharing their ideas. There's different, folks in the room, some that might be a little bit more energetic and verbal, and then you've got some introverts. So being able to make sure you're being observant and helping, elevate everyone in the room is really important. And also creating some structure and focus too. Sometimes you can get really excited and maybe go on a lot of tangents and different paths, but make sure that you're bringing everyone back to the fold and creating that focus. And that really ensures really great collaboration. So up next is also being objective. As the facilitator, you want to make sure that you are challenging ideas that people are bringing up, and also staying curious. If there's something that you might not understand or other folks in the room are trying to, get a sense of, make sure that you're asking those questions and staying curious. And, this really helps to solve problems together as a team. And then lastly, you want to make sure as a facilitator that you're goal oriented. So you're the individual that's organizing, that's extracting from folks the things that they are thinking about. You're trying to help reach decision making, or some sort of like outcome or a brainstorm session. You really think about this as a coach. You are coaching everyone through that process and helping navigate them. So these are the skills that we find really fundamental to facilitation. They're going to help you as you prepare to think about how to design facilitation. So I'm going to hand it to Cam, and she's going to talk through the different elements and components that go into designing facilitation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Roxana. So yeah, as Roxana mentioned, having those mindsets is always going to be key. But if you're thinking about planning a facilitation, the first step, even as Roxana shared, is really making sure you're prepared for that facilitation. So we'll talk through about 7-ish steps to get you prepared and ready for what that day holds for you. We'll touch on not only setting your goals for the day, designing those activities in the agenda, as well as potentially enlisting co-facilitators and recruiting participants. So this is all in this section. I am going to talk to you. I'm going to talk at you a little bit much, but I hope you still stay engaged in the chat and really call in and feel free to respond to the information. So we'll get it kicked off with setting facilitation goals. So the great thing about this is that if you're already thinking about a facilitation, you probably have some goals in mind. When I'm setting up a facilitation, I do like to ask myself a couple questions when thinking about sort of the larger themes of the facilitation. So what are the big, maybe 1 or 2 questions that we can answer during our time? But also, what does success look like? Sometimes we want to have a key output or a key impact in the session. And so being clear with that from the get-go can really help make sure as you go through the next few steps that you're being consistent with that goal. If you are planning a larger facilitation, maybe you're organizing a few different agencies or a few people you're bringing together, try at your next team meeting to reflect out that last question and have a brainstorm. Ask folks to write independently what their definitions of success for the session would be. This can also be a really defining point to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page and you're aligning your goals as much as possible. When we start to think about checking those goals, this is an essential step because once we come up with our goals, great. But when you want to check in with your goals, try doing it with a co-conspirator. So this could be a team member, this could be somebody you really trust, but ask yourself a few questions of the goals you've just set. Is this the right framing? Is it timely and attainable? Meaning, does it make sense for this time right now? And is it attainable in the time we have allotted for the facilitation? And then especially when working with community members or folks in the community, ask yourself, has this question been asked before? In Baltimore, our community members are overly researched, and so really being mindful of the existing work that is out there, make sure that we're able to not only respect fatigue with research, but also be mindful on getting deeper conversations once we're in the room with community members. So that right framing question can be a bit hard. So I did want to share an example here. Before I joined the city in May, I worked with a group at Johns Hopkins that wanted to build a dashboard for ER physicians to find out what happens to their patients after they leave the ER. And the internal team sort of set this goal for our facilitations. Not a bad goal. What do physicians want when getting feedback? Not a bad question. But as we talked to some physicians and started to think about that session, what we really found was that physicians were already doing a lot of the things. So instead, what we focused on during our facilitations was, what are physicians already doing that we might tap into or learn from? How can we create a space where they share their expertise? When thinking about framing, it's always great to put your audience in that driver's seat. As Roxana mentioned, you're the coach of the session, you're the guide, you're not the teacher. It's okay not to have all the answers. You're really trying to create a space where everyone can do their best work. So putting your audience in the driver's seat is always going to be a surefire win. So speaking of audience, the next sort of big step is to think about identifying your audience. Sometimes you're going to know exactly who you're facilitating with. Maybe it's internal team, maybe it's part of a community outreach plan that you've already set up. But it's always important to think about sort of who's in the room. And especially in situations where it's more open-ended, try considering these two questions. First off, who's going to be most impacted by your work? And how do you create a space to really bring in those voices that will be most impacted by your outcome? But also think about what skills or expertise could be helpful to involve in the conversation. Sometimes it's great to generate a lot of ideas at a facilitation, but if you're thinking about a technology solution, it might be really helpful to have somebody from your IT department or somebody with that particular program expertise in the room to really get you to a deeper point of that conversation and be able to join in on that sooner rather than later. So I'm going to uplift an activity here from the Creative Reaction Lab from their Equity Center Community Design Field Guide. It's a great resource if you haven't checked it out. But they suggest that when thinking about your audience, try grabbing a sheet of paper or working on an online whiteboard and create 6 boxes for yourself. They suggest these categories, so community members, people in the education sector, social and civic sector, but you can be flexible with what those categories are depending on your conditions. Once you have those categories assigned, try writing down names or organizations that fall under those categories. And then similar to your goals, take a moment to step back and reflect. Are some boxes fuller than others? Are any empty boxes there? Sometimes that might be an intentional choice. Maybe you're not ready to engage folks in that sector quite yet. But this last question in particular is really important as we think about impact and bringing folks into the fold. Are there any other voices or perspectives that might be missing from some of these categories? And how can we be intentional to really bring those folks in the fold? So just being, again, really mindful when you're thinking about the audience that it's not maybe just your first choice, but it's really thinking about who really belongs in that space. So you've got your goals, you're starting to do some outreach to get that audience. But now it's time to design those activities, right? Get that agenda going. Once you set your goals, they're great, but some questions are better bite-sized, right? Like that example that I shared earlier. Not a bad goal, but maybe not the question we lead with. When I'm building a facilitation, I always try to break it down into this formula. First off, we're going to build rapport. So start with an icebreaker or a simple activity. If you're in person, try like a movement activity. Always helps to warm up the space. Set the stage. So answer why this, why now, and where you hope to end up by the end of the session. A lot of times setting that context can answer a lot of questions off the bat, but also gives transparency in what you're doing. And then come up with 2, no more than 3 activities to really generate ideas and get to those meeting outputs. When we think about those, when we think about how that actually shakes out, here's a sample agenda that the I team previously used when thinking about their ad for the Baltimore versus COVID campaign. At the time, the team had already generated some print ads and were running some in different places across Baltimore, but they wanted to create a TV spot that would get out information, credible information about COVID and about vaccination. So this was the agenda they used to talk about the advertisement. So kicking it off with a relevant icebreaker. What's your favorite commercial? Setting the stage, what we've done and where we're going. So why an ad? Why now? Why is an ad useful? And then the 3 activities that they used to structure the time was they had folks watch 3 videos and talk through what they liked and what they didn't like about the examples. Again, very simple, but got some conversation already going. Then they had them rank the videos, which was really helpful when thinking about what tone is most appealing to people in this ad spot. And then the last activity was the actual sort of overall goal. So once you kind of had folks in that mindset, then they had folks ideate around the questions. You know, who would you see in the commercial? Where would they be? And what messages would be effective? So already starting to think about those ad spots from the inspiration. It's important to remember that as you're thinking about designing these activities, sort of the back half of that, not all answers have to be verbal. Some of us are really great verbal communicators, as Roxana mentioned. Some of us are extroverts, have no problem joining in the conversation. But when trying to think of activities, think about some multiple modalities that you can pull in to really get multiple perspectives. Some tried and true favorites when we're designing facilitations are dot voting. It's a great way to get sort of a visual representation and read on the group. If I'm going to answer that in the chat right now. Those activities, it took about 30 to 45 minutes. So again, very, very tight time frame, actively facilitating, guiding people through, saying, okay, great conversation, let's move to the next. When you have a larger group, consider breaking them into smaller groups that are representative of the large group. That can make sure that multiple perspectives are heard, and then you have a share out with the larger group. So that way you're getting a lot more from the group in the time that you have with them. Try a 2x2 matrix. One that we love is impact versus cost. So that way you weed out the ideas that are super costly and aren't going to make an impact, and you identify those short-term wins. Drawing out ideas and mapping resources are great for figuring out both ideas, but also inflection points in the process. And then workshop agreements are a great kickoff activity, like I said, with an icebreaker or priming the space, especially when bringing multiple groups together. They can help set ground rules to make sure that everyone is kind of on the same page within the process. Awesome. So as you think about, you've got your activities down, you know who your audience is going to be, you know what those big goals are. It's time to actually prepare those resources for your event. So it's important at this point to start thinking about that digital in-person divide. Up to this point, we haven't really felt this as much, but when thinking about those resources for your event, this is where it really comes into play. So when you're thinking about sharing slide decks aren't bad, but my one pitch and request of you is to keep them brief. Keep it to an agenda, to your why, and any next steps, right? Just keep it as a resource and less of an instructional guide. If you're thinking about bringing paper into the space, Post-its, worksheets, and big flip charts are always fan favorites of us here. But if you're thinking about that online space, think about Miro, Mural, or Jamboard. Jamboard is free, so if you have folks who have a Gmail, you can access all its features, while Miro and Mural require a sign up to get the full functionality. So just something to keep in mind. When thinking about the location, I know we have somebody who works with locations in the space. Ask what tech looks like in the space. Try to tour the space if you can, especially if you're thinking about breakout groups and you're going to move a lot of people around. It's important to kind of understand what the limitations and what the benefits of the space are. And when online, if you're thinking about a digital location like we are on today, circulate those links in advance and make sure you're prepping them with any breakout rooms or any information needed in there. And the most important part, the part that I always strive for, is the atmosphere. So if you're in person and it's around breakfast time, food and bevy go a long way. Grab some coffee, get some bagels, or even if it's in an in-between time, have snacks or candy. Always remember tunes, right? Music can really set the atmosphere. So when you're brainstorming or there's sort of some dead time, try sharing some music to keep the energy up. And then have any takeaways ready that are branded and consistent that folks can easily get after the session, either in an email or in person. All right. So only a few more steps here, and then I promise I will hand it off to my lovely co-conspirator, Roxana, who will take us through the day of. But an important step in this is going to be really enlisting co-facilitators. So this is a step that can really come anywhere, but we put it here in particular because when thinking about, again, resources, who else can support you day of? Team members obviously come to mind, right? Calling in some favors with your coworkers. But also other agencies in the city can be really helpful when thinking about partnerships, especially if you're recruiting in the community. Also partnering with community leaders and nonprofits that are already providing community support, have engaged audiences that match the audience that you want to do some outreach with. In this case, we recommend reaching out to them sooner rather than later around that goals step, to pitch those goals and ideas to see if you can co-create some of these activities together or tag on to an existing meeting. So often I get in this mindset of like, oh, I have to create it, I have to build it all. But I think one beautiful thing that the I team really does is really tag on and say, okay, how can we build capacity instead of build it ourselves? So really plugging in as much as you can. All right, so we can't talk about working with community without talking about compensation. I feel like this is always a tense part for people because there's a lot of want and sometimes not a lot of funds that back that up, but compensating community is a must, point blank. If you work in Baltimore City, the Innovation Fund is a great resource. A big note about this, though, is that after that initial loan or investment, you do have to have something that pays back that seed. So this might be great for if you're thinking about digital programs or services that already involve some sort of funds, might be a great option for that. Also consider requesting a budget enhancement. The ones for fiscal year 24 have already passed, but consider as you're thinking about your outreach plans for the next year or 2 years, for fiscal year 25, making that part of your enhancement request. If you are more grant-based or if you're getting ARPA funding, if you're at a fellow government agency, set aside a portion for community outreach. You can plan early on this, but also work with, if you're in an academic institution, work with your IRB or make amendments to the grant as much as possible. It's never too late to make sure you have those funds set aside and you have that flexibility. But if budget is tight, right? Budget is always a consideration. Try raffling for the event, right? So one prize for all the attendees. Raffling is also great for surveys if you're doing outreach that way. Consider partnering with a library that has children's programming that you can plug into, especially if you're engaging with parents who are already running up against daycare factors. Also, don't be afraid to trade skills or design support. If you have something to offer, that is sometimes really integral to where folks are, and a flyer can go a long way. All right, 2 more steps, I promise. So facilitator training, especially if you've enlisted co-facilitators, you want to take the time to assign some roles day of. Some ones that we've found really helpful are the note taker, right? So this is a person who's recording everything that happens day of, allows you to be present, as Roxana mentioned, be that active listener. A photographer in the space. If you are working with community, always make sure to get consent and consent forms. But working with photographer can really help you on the back end, sort of visually tell the story of your community outreach. And then tech support. Today, Emily is supporting us with sharing the slides. Roxana's watching the chat. You can definitely tag team this effort, but it is always really helpful to have somebody who's helping you navigate this space so that way you can stay present. One thing that we do recommend is set a date to run through. It seems silly, but it helps you work out any kinks or anything that comes up with the facilitation and helps everyone know kind of what their responsibilities are in the space. All right, last one, recruiting participants. So you set your goals, you have your audience, you've built all your lovely facilitation activities, you're paying your co-facilitators if they're involved and community, maybe you're raffling a prize. It's time to actually think about recruiting folks and making sure that they attend the session. So what we found the most helpful, the most impactful when thinking about recruiting participants is working with trusted partners and colleagues with connection. So if here in Baltimore City, we have the Mayor's Office of Neighborhoods that is constantly doing outreach, but there are always agencies within your local city government that are engaged and doing the work day in, day out on the street. So it's important to engage those folks as you think about doing outreach and again, sort of building capacity and not rebuilding it yourself. Tag in again with community groups, nonprofits, and community leaders. These are trusted experts, right? They're people who are already engaged in the community. And so plugging into their passion and again, building capacity is going to be really essential here. But also consider local tastemakers and influencers. We'll share an example in a second about the Baltimore versus COVID campaign, but these are really vested communities. Try considering a local eatery can be a good exchanging point for folks who are already in that community, right? If there's a local fave, and partnering with them to create that space to recruit. So again, I mentioned we were going to share this example. So for the Baltimore versus COVID campaign, again, as we were thinking about not only the ad spots, but also the print materials, the team worked with community leaders, business, city employees, residents, and really the goal was to recruit and enlist those credible messengers to promote positive messages about vaccine benefits and safety measures that folks could use. So the whole campaign was really centered around elevating these folks who are already pillars of their community. And working with over 50 credible messengers, the team was able to generate these ads that were targeted to folks within their communities, but also reflected the voice of those people and what they wanted to say about the pandemic. The team was able to create over 70 print and digital ads that were circulated with those credible messengers and 3 vaccine videos that started in the seeds of that facilitation activity that we talked about earlier. All right, so the last point here is to, when you're thinking about recruiting participants, if you're working with those trusted partners, or maybe you have some connections that you're tapping into, make sure that you're consistently messaging in the medium that makes the most sense for your audience. Consistency is the best thing you can give your audience, because that time and time again will make a clear pathway for engagement. So if you're working with email, it's great for coworkers, city events, or organizations with listservs. Just make sure in that email you have a clear call to action, your links are clear, and it's very streamlined. If you're working with a call, it's great for older adults or maybe folks that you already have an engaged partnership with. Social media is always great. Again, we always talk about it for youth, but consider if you don't have existing social media channels to do a takeover for folks who you're thinking about engaging, but that audience is already plugged in elsewhere. A takeover can also really help, again, sort of build that capacity instead of build it yourself. And then face-to-face, if you're already doing outreach in the community, consider making a flyer or considering making, just handing out business cards. The more you can kind of build on what you're already doing, the more streamlined it'll be for you later down the line. All right. So that was all of the preparation ones. If you didn't catch it, if you're like, wow, that seems like a lot, no worries. We do have a worksheet, which we'll talk about at the end to walk you through all of those steps. I'm going to hand it over now to Roxana, who's going to actually talk about the day of and post event and what you can expect from that facilitation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Cam. That was a lot of really great information. I hope everyone's feeling well informed about how to prepare and design a facilitation for, a future session that you might be doing. So for the day up, a couple of things to think about. Just some tips here. These are things that I want you to think of these as mindsets. As a facilitator, not necessarily absolutes, but just a mindset to have when you're going into that type of space. So for instance, we've talked about, again, being a coach, and instead of feeling like you have to have all the answers to everything, instead really try, thinking about the questions that you want to ask and focusing on how to extract that information from the folks that you're bringing to the table in that session. Another thing too is just instead of trying to feel like you have to urge everyone to complete and check off boxes, instead try engaging and focusing on collaboration with everyone. Again, your session might lead in a different place than you anticipated. Another thing too, instead of expecting perfection and wanting everything to be just how you planned, really embrace uncertainty and trust the process. Sometimes just by doing this, the outcomes and results that you get, can be really surprising. And lastly, I think this one's one that is super challenging for folks, definitely pushes everyone, but instead of shutting down or trying to avoid conflict if it feels uncomfortable, instead try encouraging different perspectives. Again, remember the goal of having an inclusive group and a diverse group from different backgrounds is that everyone is going to bring each of their strengths and help you get to, a creative solution, creative thinking, and outside of the box thinking. So a couple things to think about for the day of. Another thing that's really important for the day of is really thinking about how you're going to document all the information that you're hearing from folks, right? It's going to feel like it's coming at you. Hopefully you got people that are engaged, excited. So a couple things to think about. One, it's really important to think about creating a shared document where everyone on your team can be able to incorporate things that they're hearing. And this really helps to think about, again, to Cam's point, like identify a note taker, designate that person who can help with documenting. And with them doing this in real time, you're able to record things like if there's decisions that are made, or if there are action items that you need to follow up on. Sometimes we can forget those things if we're only thinking about, putting them in our head, but having them recorded is really helpful. Uh, Third, really think about making sure that you're capturing your meeting attendees. This is really important because you might want to follow up with folks. You might want to share your presentation. You might want to share materials that they're interested in having. So being able to capture their email, a way that you can contact them afterwards is really important. And lastly, really think about using visuals too. These are really helpful if you're in online setting like we are today. I've already seen in the chat, folks have mentioned Miro, Mural, Jamboard. These are all really great tools that allow folks to, add their own input and that you can go back to and look at. And then if you're in person, this looks a little different, but you still can capture information by using large writing pads or also big Post-its on the walls, things like that. So think about these 4 different ways to make sure you're documenting really important key parts of your event. So up next, we're going to wrap up by talking about, what we do post the event. There's some key, really important things when you want to think about after the event. You've done a successful event. How do you kind of tie any loose ends? So first up is thinking about the folks that have helped support the event. So for instance, when you have facilitators that have helped supported your event, you're going to want to think about ways that you can capture some lessons learned. So you're going to want to do a debrief. So for instance, there's a couple of things you want to do. These are really important because they can help you learn some things to help improve your next event. So with your facilitators who've supported, if you are doing an online event, you might have breakout rooms. If you're in person, you might have breakout tables. So you're going to want to hear the different feedback from these individuals. So one thing that's helpful is, potentially sending out some sort of debrief survey in advance to capture some of their feedback after the event. You're going to want to also convene the group and be able to hear things and have a conversation. So again, creating some sort of agenda and questions for them is really important. And I would say one thing you really want to go back to is just starting off by recapping those objectives. You want to ask yourself, did we achieve what we set out to do? That's a really good start. And if you've captured any data from the event, share that. I think, as a facilitator, you're going to want to hear how the session went, how other folks felt if you weren't at all the different tables. And lastly, perform some sort of analysis, whether that's a reflection, again, thinking about what worked well, what didn't, and, identifying some things that could be changed or lesson learned. Lesson learned is really important. So on the flip side, here we were talking about your staff, your team that's helping you. You also want to think about your participants who attended the session. So for the folks that attended, you really, well, let me pause real quick before I get into that. We have an example here. So for the innovation team, one of our projects was digital equity. We wanted to make sure we were going out and hearing feedback from folks. So here we're at the Druid Heights Community Development Corporation. We did a in-person workshop. We enlisted facilitators who were part of the community. They were part of nonprofit organizations, resident leaders, and youth ambassadors as well. And they helped us to facilitate sessions at the different breakout tables. So we wanted to make sure that our goal was to hear feedback from them directly about the event logistics. Did we plan things well? Did we help prepare them to feel like they were ready to facilitate? and hear any like comments that they heard from residents. So again, we reconvened the group. We were able to do initial debrief right after the event, but with a lot of energy and noise in the background going on, we also like make sure that we brought them back in a virtual session so they could again take some time to think about things that went well, give us that reflection. So we also asked them, hey, what went well? What could we improve on? We heard and shared learnings from the residents, which really interested them. We also offered too a way to provide alternative feedback. Not everyone could join us, so we wanted to make sure that they felt like they were heard. And lastly, we wanted to make sure that we just wrapped up with thanking them for their time. Cam talked about compensation, so we made sure to remind them how to complete their compensation paperwork, and then also, offer them ways that they could stay engaged with us for the future as well. So now for the participants who attend the event, you also want to make sure that you are doing some things to kind of wrap up the event for them too. So also making sure that you're acknowledging their contribution. They've taken time out of their day to go. Also offer them a space to be able to share any insights on how they felt and what they experienced that day. So a simple, quick survey is really great. And lastly, too, like you want to make sure that you're sharing the experience, possibly like on your website or on social channels, because there might be other folks who are following the progress of a project or activity that you're doing. And that's another way to really be able to promote and keep everyone informed about what's going on. So we've talked a little bit about, all the day of and post event activities. We're now gonna switch. I'm gonna hand it over to Emily to talk about what happens when you're thrown a curveball.
Thank you so much, Roxana. Boy, do I have some stories for you all of things that have gone wrong during workshops that I have helped facilitate or led the facilitation for. So, we always like to plan out every last detail for our workshops and events. But we know that we can't always plan for everything. So it's good to have this mentality of, unexpected things may happen. And it's good to embrace it. And instead of, maybe feeling uncomfortable with it or getting thrown off. I mean, I've had plenty of deer in the headlight moments when things have gone a bit awry. But as a facilitator, like you really do help in setting a tone for the group, but sometimes that's not enough. Like sometimes you have to read the vibes of everyone who's participating and try to understand like how you think things are going and adapt and pivot if something just isn't working and you think that maybe the activity as planned will not achieve the goals that you have set for yourself with your team. So I am going to share a real life example. This comes from my time working in the federal government. So this was a facilitation that my team was part of for a security conference that was hosted at Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles. It was my first time at the stadium. It was a really cool experience. But the audience was C-suite security specialists from the private sector. And our goal was we really wanted to understand their current challenges and what their view on government's role was in potentially mitigating those challenges. So again, like for planning, we created this very detailed agenda. We wanted everything to be like super polished. We practiced everything. Our intention was to have our participants complete these activities in pairs or groups of 3 with us facilitating them through it. But, this was an example of, and this was many, many years ago, of not necessarily like really anticipating the audience's needs based on who was coming to the table. So the day of, we got there and the executives all sat down and we handed out worksheets and everything and pens, and they were much more interested in hearing from everybody who was there. They didn't want to break into small groups. They didn't want to write anything down. I mean, if you're at that level, you have an executive assistant typically. I think it's less common to take your own notes. So what we did, we scrapped our plans. We leaned into this larger round table and we said, okay, we're going to play it like this for the rest of the session, and we'll do it for the next session as well. And because we did lean into it, and we sort of like changed our roles to fit into the new structure and make sure that we were documenting everything properly, we ended up getting a lot of great information from them. So this was an example of maybe we could have planned better just based on the audience and who was going to be there. But it was like a very big lesson in, what to do when maybe an activity just isn't working, and feeling comfortable doing that. So a little call and response, I would love for all of you to think of a time when you maybe planned an event and it didn't go the way that you thought it would. What happened? How did you respond? And you're welcome to add that to the chat if you want. If you want to just keep it to yourself and, ruminate on it, you're welcome to do that as well. We really do look at mistakes as being learning opportunities. So this is an opportunity to learn and grow. Really adopting, Roxana talked a little bit earlier about the adaptability, having more of a growth mindset. It can feel bad to make mistakes, but we all make them at times. It's a very human thing. So if you just frame them as opportunities, and, you have some kind of growth from them, we're just, as Bob Ross says, happy little accidents. So take a breath and go with it.